This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nissa and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. In Magic, there are lots of slang terms used to refer to certain stat lines, and most of them are based on cards that appeared in Magic's very first set back in 1993. For example, a Hill Giant refers to a 4-mana 3/3, and a Bear is a 2-mana 2/2. I've already done top 10s on these and other stat lines, and today we're going to take a look at Grey Ogres, which are 3-mana 2/2s. Obviously, a 3-mana 2/2 creature is horrible if that's all it is, so a card has to have some nice stuff going on in order to overcome that stat line. In Magic's long history, there have been 824 3-mana 2/2 creatures, and in this video, we'll talk about the 10 that have left the biggest impact on Magic's competitive history. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Mirren Crusader. This is a 3-mana 2/2 that's just a French vanilla creature, but it has enough keyword abilities crammed into its text box that it definitely overcomes its mediocre stat line. It was featured in both main decks and sideboards while it was in standard and primarily in aggro decks. The Crusader's protection was a big deal in the right matchup, as a 2/2 unblockable double striker that is immune to removal is obviously really good. Some key cards that couldn't do anything to stop the Crusader included Huntmaster of the Fells and Primeval Titan. More recently, it's also seen significant play in Modern as a sideboard card in human decks and in the main board of Hate Bear decks. It's also featured in Legacy, Death, and Taxes. The Crusader has 0 points since 2019 though, and might fall off of this list in the future. At number 9, it is Goblin Rabblemaster, a Grey Ogre who spits out creature tokens and gets bigger the more goblins that attack with it. If you can keep the table clear of blockers, the Rabblemaster will just wreck your opponent all on its own, and even if they do find removal for it at some point, you're still going to have some goblin tokens left over most of the time. The Rabblemaster was mostly played in red aggro decks while it was in standard, and it has gained points in the same types of decks in Pioneer. It also has a few points in Modern, one coming in Scred Red and the other in Mardu Pyromancer. The Rabblemaster is also played as a win condition in mono-red prison decks in Legacy, where it can pressure the opponent without any additional mana investment. At number 8, it is Etched Champion, a Grey Ogre that overcomes its stat line with a super powerful Metalcraft. It gains protection from all the colors when you get there. This card didn't see any play in block or standard, but it was right at home in modern affinity decks, where Metalcraft was pretty much a foregone conclusion. Additionally, those decks utilize things like Cranial Plating and Arcbound Ravager that could make your unblockable, untargetable Etched Champion absolutely massive, and that feels really good. The bad news for the Champion is that the traditional modern affinity deck has evolved in a direction where it is very focused now on plus and plus one counters, and the Champion doesn't fit quite as nicely into that deck as it did into old affinity. As a result, it hasn't gained any points since 2019. At number 7, it is Plague Engineer, a Grey Ogre who really hates tribal decks. Modern and Legacy are both formats where tribal decks are a big presence. Humans in Modern and Elves and Merfolk in Legacy, and the Engineer really wreaks havoc on both of those decks. While it isn't quite as potent against Eldrazi, they are a presence in both formats as well, and the Engineer is pretty good against them too. It also hates on any deck that is really focused on 1/1 creature tokens. For example, it's good against the Thopter Sword combo. The prevalence of those decks means the Engineer has been played a whole lot since its relatively recent printing in 2019, and because the effect is also one-sided, it can even be played in mirror matches. It's going to continue to gain points in both formats. At number 6, it is Nissa Vastwood Seer, a Grey Ogre who can transform into a Planeswalker. Nissa was a nice card in Standard. A 3-mana 2/2 that draws you a forest would see a bit of play in Standard in most cases, and that's what you get at minimum out of Nissa. She helps make sure you hit that 4th land, and that's not a bad thing to have around. Once you get that 7th land into play, though, she transforms from being a rather unassuming 3-mana 2/2 into the powerful Planeswalker Nissa Sage Animist. She sports a +1 that draws you a card, a -2 that can make you a 4/4 elemental to protect her, and an ultimate that turns lands into 6/6 elementals. That's a pretty nice package to have, especially because you only ever ended up paying 3 mana for it. She was one of the more heavily played cards of the Standard over time, and she was made especially attractive by the presence of collected company decks since she was a creature you could grab with the powerful instant, and getting a planeswalker out of Collected Company is pretty awesome. Despite all her successes in Standard, Nissa has never really transitioned into any other formats, but I don't think it's completely out of the question that it happens at some point. At number 5, I have Knight of the Reliquary. This Grey Ogre gets around the bad stat line by just not being a 3-mana 2/2 for very long and coming with the powerful ability to tutor up lands, including non-basic ones, and put them into play. In Standard, it was mostly played in aggro decks, and these aggro decks would run singleton copies of things like Sajiri's Step, which could be particularly useful on the right board, or Tectonic Edge, which could blow up a problem land. In Extended, it was played in Life from the Loam decks, a deck that really likes toolbox lands, and obviously it fits in quite well there. It could grab you singleton copies of things like Treetop Village, which was pretty sweet to search up in response to a removal spell or a board sweeper. In Modern, where it is featured in Collected Company decks these days, it can search you up a Field of Ruin when you really need it. In Modern, it also gained a few points in a combo deck that combines the Knight with Coral Helm Retreat. Because the Knight fetches you a land, it constantly triggers the landfall, allowing the Knight to untap and do it again as many times as you want. In Legacy, it's played most in Junk and Maverick, where it can be used to search up Caracas and Bajuka Bog when those things might be useful. It doesn't have any points in 2021 so far, but that has more to do with the pandemic than it does with whether or not this card is being played in various formats. It doesn't have any points in 2021 so far, but that has more to do with the pandemic than it does with whether or not this card is being played in various formats. At number 4, it is Pia Nalar. This Grey Ogre brings a 1/1 Thopter to the table, and she has a bunch of artifact upside. She provides fire breathing for artifact creatures like her Thopter friend, and she has the ability to sacrifice artifacts to make creatures unable to block. She was played a ton in Standard aggro decks that had artifact sub-themes as a result of a plethora of vehicles and other artifact synergies. She has not gained any points outside of Standard yet, but she is being played some in Pioneer, and that might add to her score in the future. Even if she doesn't add to her score, though, she has a pretty huge score, all accumulated in Standard alone. At number 3, it is Geist of St. Traft, a Grey Ogre who comes with hexproof and the ability to bring a 4/4 flyer into combat with him. This means Geist represents a ton of damage for a very low cost. It's been a win condition in control decks and a card that aggro decks want to play too, especially aggro decks that have auras or other effects to make Geist really scary. The one downside he has is how easily he dies in combat, but if you slap an aura or equipment on him, that's going to be a lot harder for your opponent. It was played a ton in Standard, especially in Blue-White Delver, which like to put Rune Chanter's Pike on the Geist, but it was also played in aura-centric decks as well. In Modern, its most frequent home has been various Blue-White control decks. Geist is also featured in Legacy's Stoneblade, which has all kinds of sweet equipment to put on Geist so he can continue to attack and bring his angel into combat with him. At number 2, it is Fominator Mage, a Grey Ogre who comes with the ability to blow up lands. It hardly saw play in Block or Standard, where the ability to blow up lands wasn't all that useful. However, it has performed incredibly well in Modern, a format where powerful non-basic lands are everywhere. Fominator Mage also works particularly well with Living End, where you can play the mage early to blow up a non-basic land and then do it again when you cast Living End. He also sees a ton of play in Jund and more recently in Collected Company decks, which can do sort of toolboxy things, and sometimes you really need a Fulminator Mage to blow up a Tron land or something. Its most recent home has been in the sideboard of Death's Shadow. The Mage is likely to continue to accumulate points, and it'll be interesting to see whether it will ever catch the number 1 card on this list, which is Monastery Mentor, which certainly has a strong claim to being the best 3-mana 2/2 in the entire history of Magic. After all, it not only comes with prowess, but the ability to churn out a 1/1 with prowess every single time you play a non-creature spell. Monastery Mentor can add huge amounts of damage to the board in a hurry. While it only had modest success in both Standard and Modern, it has thrived the most in Eternal formats, where there are lots of powerful, and free, spells that trigger this ability. In those formats, Monastery Mentor serves as a great win condition in a variety of decks. In Legacy, this has primarily been Miracle decks, and in Vintage, the Mentor spawned an entire archetype named for it. Ultimately, Monastery Mentor proved a little too good for people to be allowed to play 4 copies of it in Vintage, and this actually led to it being restricted in Magic's most powerful format, which can tell you a lot about how good this card is. Even with the restriction, Vintage decks are still playing the 1 copy that they are allowed to play. Overall, Monastery Mentor will continue to accumulate points going forward, and most likely it will be able to hold off Fulminator Mage. Well, those are the 10 3-mana 2/2s that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these Grey Ogres, you can buy them at Card Kingdom. In the description, you'll find a direct link to each of them within their store. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it, as that increases the chances of others enjoying it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the 350 plus MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Finally, if you like listening to me talk about Magic, consider listening to me also talk about history. You should see a link to my other YouTube channel, Nissa History, on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.